Greetings and salutations, my friend. In my last video, I talked about how the presence of black characters in films and games does not make those films or games woke, and that the focus on calling absolutely everything woke that has those black characters and the politicization of the skin color of people on the big screen or the small screen is honestly a bit annoying and toxic. However, today I wish to talk about one example where the criticism towards the presence of a black character in this type of medium might actually be justified. Or maybe not, who knows? Let's see. The character I'm talking about is obviously Yasuke, the Black Samurai, the real historical figure and a star of an upcoming Ubisoft game. Assassin's Creed Shadows is the newest and still unreleased game in a historical video game series. The games in this series take place in different time periods and geographical locations, such as Ptolemaic Egypt, classical antiquity in Greece, American Revolution, French Revolution, Italian Renaissance, and so on. Assassin's Creed Shadows takes place in Japan, in the 16th century Japan. So, where exactly does the problem lie? What is the criticism here? It features this black character, Yasuke, and a lot of people have been freaking out about it. It might seem that it is almost impossible to talk about the character of Yasuke this day without being labeled racist, if you even dare to question the possibility whether he was or wasn't a samurai. However, it is also clear to me that a lot of those people who are critical of Yasuke's role in these games have also absolutely loved other black characters in the same game series, such as Bayek, Adewale, Evelyn.
Vanquished by a gang of ruffians, huh? Silent as kept.
So, why would anyone have an issue with Yasuke if they don't have issues with those other characters? A very common argument is that while Bayek belonged in that ancient Egypt setting and Adewale belonged in the Caribbean setting, there is no reason to have a black protagonist in a Japanese setting, right? I mean, let's see, while Middle Eastern settings have Middle Eastern protagonists, such as Altair and Basim. The game set during the Italian Renaissance had an Italian protagonist, Ezio Auditore. A game set in North America had a Native American protagonist. I think it's understandable why the Japanese players, let's say, would want to have Japanese representation in this game. However, they've been given Yasuke, so to some it might feel like anti-Asian racism. However, they've also been given another Japanese protagonist that stars in this game alongside Yasuke, Naoe. So there's really no reason to complain, right? Well, I think the problem might lie in how Ubisoft chose to market this specific game. Yasuke will be the Assassin's Creed series' first protagonist that is an actual historical figure. And while we did have a chance to play as King Leonidas in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, that was like, 10 minutes of screen time? I would hardly call that a protagonist. There really won't be any argument from my side about Yasuke's existence. There's enough evidence to support the fact that yes, Yasuke was an actual historical figure and that he served under the daimyo or the lord Oda Nobunaga. But was Yasuke an actual samurai, or is that just Ubisoft's interpretation of history? Well, according to their marketing and how they were promoting this game, they claimed that Yasuke was actually a samurai. The way it was stated sounded almost like it's a historical fact. He was a samurai. And don't you dare questioning that, or else, well, you're racist. So if Yasuke actually was a samurai, That's great. That's awesome. This scores Africans a lot of points, right? So it's understandable why people want him to be a samurai. However, there are also those who argue that Yasuke wasn't a samurai, who claim that they have debunked it. And I think that the whole Yasuke debate really got incorporated into this so-called culture war. My intention is not to make this video about culture war. I think I focused enough on the political side of things in the first section of this video. From now on, I really want to focus on just my pure curiosity, just the need to get to the truth of things. And before I start, just one thing I want to say is that no matter what conclusion I arrived at, whether Yasuke was a samurai or not, that does not change my opinion on Yasuke as a historical figure and as a character. I still think he's an interesting historical figure, whether he was given the title of samurai or not. If we are to answer the question of whether Yasuke was a samurai, well, I think the first good question to ask is when? Because you see, there really is no singular correct definition of a samurai, because that definition has been changing throughout the years. So what a samurai has been in, let's say, 1700s would be very different from what samurai was and the role of a samurai in 1200s, let's say. For this reason, before we should even attempt to answer the question of whether Yasuke was a samurai or not, we need to take a look at Japanese history and the changing definition and the role of samurai in different time periods. The origin of samurai, and yes, I'm using samurai as a plural form because it's a Japanese word and there really is no difference between the singular and plural form in Japanese. So a samurai can mean one samurai, or it can mean 5 or 200 samurai. But their origin can be traced back all the way to the Heian period, which lasted from the 8th to the 12th century. And during that time period, samurai were retainers and servants to the emperor and the imperial court, as well as the kuge class, which was nobility, and a lot of individuals from kuge class had positions in the imperial court. What exactly was the role of samurai as those servants and retainers? They were assistants, they were bodyguards and guardians. But the main point isn't exactly their role as much as who they served, and that is the higher end of the hierarchy in Japanese society. Moreover, samurai was also sort of a prestigious title because you had to be granted at least the 5th rank in the imperial court to even be given the title of a samurai. So it wasn't a easily attainable position by any means. The word samurai comes from the old Japanese saburo, meaning to serve by one's side. So the servants to the emperor, the servants to the imperial court, and later on, well, let's find out. The definition of samurai changed quite a lot in the Kamakura period. That's when the first shogunate got established, shogunate being a form of a feudal military government. The first shogunate got established by Minamoto no Yoritomo, literally translating to Yoritomo of Minamoto, or more precisely, Yoritomo of the Minamoto clan. Individuals were usually named after their clan because culturally belonging to a clan had a bigger importance than belonging to a family. And so Minamoto no Yoritomo became Japan's first shogun, the military leader of the shogunate. The first shogunate was called Kamakura shogunate, hence why the name of the time period is the Kamakura period. During that time period, samurai still occupied a pretty high position in the societal hierarchy in Japan, being, well, landowners. And those people who were allowed to own land were called gokenin in Japanese. And while they'll have this privilege to own land, they also sworn to protect the shogun and the shogunate. In the time of war, they had to fulfill that military duty. So one thing that samurai in the Heian period, in the Kamakura period, definitely had in common is this loyalty to the one they serve. And it will become a very common theme in what samurai were throughout all the centuries of their existence. The honor and loyalty that are so central to their code, the so-called Bushido code. In the Sengoku period, which lasted from the 15th and 17th century, things get a little more complicated, and that is also the time period in Japanese history that is of most interest to us in this video, because that's when Yasuke was alive. So while previously samurai were considered a societal class, once we enter the Sengoku period, things get a little more blurry. The line between the societal class and the military rank becomes a little more unclear. Because in that time period it became much easier to be granted the rank of samurai. And by easier, I don't necessarily mean easy, just less hard. It used to be harder.
That's what she said!
Because in the Sengoku period, you could be granted the rank of a samurai by military achievements. Anyone who distinguished themselves in battle, in war, could become a samurai. Technically, you didn't have to serve a daimyo, a lord, although most samurai still did. Those samurai who have achieved that level of military skill, that level of accomplishment, were still few, although there were more people calling themselves samurai now that wouldn't be considered samurai by the Heian or the Kamakura standards. And then there were Ronin, which sometimes people confuse with samurai or use them interchangeably and synonymously. However, there's a huge difference between a Ronin and a samurai. Ronin were mostly ex-samurai. They were warriors without a lord. Usually where the daimyo, the lord, dies, what the samurai would usually do is that they will commit the so-called seppuku, cutting of the stomach, and die alongside their lord. Personally, I think it's, completely understandable why they would choose not to go down that road. I don't think I would either, to be honest, but I accept that there are some cultural differences and that I am not really able to relate to the code of honor and loyalty that samurai subscribed to. So in some ways, Ronin were traitors to the code. However, there's also something very romantic about the Ronin and the idea of Ronin, the warrior without a lord, because they were often portrayed as those wanderers and drifters. I think there's definitely this romantic aspect of the wanderer and drifter that is so common and present in Japanese culture and Japanese literature and film. Things take turn again in the Edo period. And I'm so glad it does not have a P at the start, because, well, that would get really dark. Dark ages indeed. Basically, anything that has a P in front of its name is bad news. Do I need to say more? However, Edo period was as far from Dark Ages as it possibly could be. It is also one of my favorite time periods in Japanese history and possibly the most well-known time period in Japanese history outside of Japan. Edo period was known for being a very peaceful time in Japanese history. You could even say that the Edo period was somewhat a Japanese Renaissance, or some sort of mix of the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, because both art and science really flourished in Japan in that time period. That being said, because the Edo period was so peaceful, what that also entailed is that the role of a samurai had to change, and largely moved away from the military role. Samurai more often held roles that were political or diplomatic. And so the title of samurai was no longer granted through military achievement as it could have been done in the Sengoku period. And so the title of a samurai became exclusively hereditary again, as it did in the Kamakura in the Heian period. With one slight difference, of course, because now you could also become a samurai by being adopted by a gokenin family, a land-owning family. If you were adopted by such a family, you would also automatically become a samurai. The Meiji era, which was a very short time period in Japanese history, lasting only from the late 19th century to early 20th century. But the Meiji era saw the end of the samurai class. And you know, it's kind of understandable, right? The modern military pretty much replaced samurai. There was no longer a need for samurai in the post-industrial society. Once the samurai class saw its dissolution, they became the so-called shizoku class, which was really more of a symbolic thing rather than an actual class, because it didn't really grant them any certain positions or privileges. They were pretty much just like any regular citizen, with this one little fact that they used to belong to the samurai class, which no longer is. And so they were stripped of all their class privileges and the right to bear weapons such as katana. I think it makes perfect sense that a lot of the ex-samurai in the Meiji era joined Yakuza, because Yakuza customs and culture was very much inspired by the samurai code, their way of living, and their philosophy. So a lot of them would really find themselves in the Yakuza culture, because they're both based in honor and loyalty. And even some rituals there are kind of similar, like cutting off your pinky. Although, you know, it's a much lighter version of committing seppuku. So if I really had to choose, you know, if someone was pointing a gun to my head and I had no choice, I think I'd say goodbye to this little fucker. Because there's just no way I am cutting open my stomach. I don't want to lose its content, you know, because let me tell you, that spaghetti was delicious.
Real, hearty, rustic, wholesome Italian food. Rich with tomatoes, nice texture in the meatball, and a perfectly cooked linguine. Lovely.
Now, taking all this information into consideration, let's start answering our question. Who exactly was Yasuke? First, I think we can make a safe assumption about what Yasuke likely wasn't, and that wasn't a Ronin. From the existing historical documents, and there are actually very few, we know that he served Daimyo, the Lord Oda Nobunaga, so he wasn't the Ronin, the wanderer, drifter, the masterless samurai. However, we don't really know what happened to Yasuke after Oda Nobunaga's death. Did he die before that? Was he still alive? Was he actually a Ronin at the time? There are very few sources and documents that could really confirm anything, so those are best guesses at best. But focusing only on the time period in which the game takes place, he definitely wouldn't be a Ronin at that time. Now, knowing what Yasuke most likely wasn't in the timeline of this game, let's focus on what he was. I think it's much easier and safer to consider whether Yasuke was a bushi or a buke before we start considering whether he was a samurai. And what exactly is a bushi or a buke? Directly, it means warrior. And a lot of the times, the terms like samurai and bushi are being used synonymously. But the thing is, they're not the same. Because bushi refers to any type of warrior that is really skilled at his craft or makes a living with a sword. And so, throughout the history of the existence of the samurai class, maybe with exception for the Edo period at most times, every samurai would also be a bushi. However, not every bushi is a samurai, because a lot of bushi do not meet the different criteria in different time periods. There's a requirement for being called a samurai. There's also a reason why those two terms are being used synonymously, because there's definitely an overlap between a samurai and a bushi, since they both live by the Bushido code. And so Yasuke, as a retainer, as a bearer of weapons, and a bodyguard of Oda Nobunaga, likely possessed some military skill. I think there's a huge possibility that we could consider Yasuke to be a bushi. However, because every samurai was a bushi, but not every bushi was a samurai, this alone does not really give us a solid argument that Yasuke was actually a samurai. One argument that can be made against Yasuke being a samurai is that samurai usually had a last name. Being so high in the societal hierarchy, there is no mention of Yasuke's last name. This could imply that he wasn't actually a samurai. I think it's a solid argument, but I also think we should look at other arguments, because there might be something that supports the exact opposite, that he might actually have been a samurai. I think the best argument one could possibly make for Yasuke being a samurai is the historical loophole in the definition of samurai during the Sengoku period when the game is taking place. And as I discussed earlier in this video, the requirement for achieving the samurai rank in the Sengoku period were a bit more loose and relaxed, and so one could become a samurai through military achievements. There's also no particular evidence of Yasuke distinguishing himself in war or battle. No mention of any military achievements. And this really puts a hole in the argument, doesn't it? If Yasuke really was the great bushi, the great warrior of his time, we would probably know it. The biggest challenge we face when determining whether Yasuke was a samurai or not are the limitations regarding the existence of the sources and the documents that would confirm anything, because there's not much of that really. Considering that most samurai of the Sengoku period were serving a daimyo, and that's pretty much what Yasuke did, he was serving a daimyo, Oda Nobunaga, this is yet another reason to suspect that there's a possibility that he was a samurai, because that's what samurai actually were. They were retainers, they were the bodyguards of the daimyo. While some might argue that Yasuke couldn't possibly be a samurai because it was a title granted exclusively to Japanese, that is not exactly true. There have been few exceptions in history. If we think about it realistically, it does pose a certain challenge, because it would be much harder for someone like Yasuke to receive that title than for someone who was a native Japanese. And well, Yasuke isn't really a native Japanese.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock!
But it's not impossible. Another argument against Yasuke being a samurai I see quite a lot is that he couldn't possibly be one because samurai is a hereditary title. This argument is being made in one of the Substack articles, Yasuke, Debunking Pseudo-Historical Myths About Black Samurai, by Dr. Alaric Nude? Shit, I hope it's not nude, because usually I don't like my doctors being nude. And it's kind of uncomfortable. Unless they're cute. In his article, and I also think he makes a lot of good arguments in it, so it's not me shitting on it, it's just this one thing I'm disagreeing with. In this article, he compares the hereditary social class of samurai to the knighting system in medieval Europe, and how you become a knight through military training and possessing the skill. I don't think it's a sufficient argument to make a claim that Yasuke couldn't possibly be a samurai for this reason, because as we know, that was literally a possibility in the Sengoku period when the game takes place. And so there exists a possibility, but there's a big difference between the possibility of something and the fact. And the truth is, we don't have facts. We could, of course, discuss other possibilities, such as, was he an Ashigaru? Ashigaru being a temporarily hired soldier. Well, that's something to consider, right? Possibly Yasuke was just temporarily hired by Oda Nobunaga. However, Ashigaru were usually foot soldiers, and it seems that Yasuke had a much bigger role in that, and he was much closer to Oda Nobunaga as his retainer and bodyguard. We could also discuss whether Yasuke would meet the requirements for becoming a samurai in other time periods than Sengoku period, but no matter how I look at it, there would be no way, like in the Heian period, there's no way he would have the 5th rank in the imperial court, and of course he didn't serve a shogun, so he couldn't be a samurai in the Kamakura period. He wasn't adopted by a Gokenin family either, so he couldn't be a samurai by the Edo period standards. The only window for someone like Yasuke to achieve that rank of samurai would exist in Sengoku period, and that's exactly when Yasuke lived. So the way I see it, the theory of Yasuke being a samurai is not confirmed. The best answer I can give is, it's plausible. It's definitely plausible. And so I think that this whole Yasuke thing in the new Assassin's Creed game wouldn't really be controversial if Ubisoft just stated, this is our interpretation of this historical figure and this historical time period. And there will be nothing wrong with that. Assassin's Creed is already historical fiction, and there were things in pretty much every Assassin's Creed game that aren't exactly historically accurate. If you're learning history from Assassin's Creed, that's really not the best way to learn history. Because they marketed it as a historical fact that he was a samurai, obviously that creates a problem and creates the controversy, and it seems that a lot of the ideas about Yasuke that Ubisoft is using in this game come from no one else than Thomas Lockley, which is an associate professor at the Nihon University in Japan. In 2019, Lockley published his book, African Samurai, The True Story of Yasuke, a legendary black warrior in feudal Japan. And while this book certainly brought attention and popularity to the character of Yasuke, with him getting his own anime and shit and now being a character in a video game, this book has also been criticized for not being very historically accurate. I mean, it seems weird to me how from very few available mentions and documents you could make a whole book. I think that this book can also be considered a historical fiction rather than history. Thomas Lockley has also received criticism for his takes on slavery and how the Japanese has contributed to the slavery of African people, which is a non-factual statement and that a lot of Japanese people have a problem with, which is completely understandable. I came across this video and I think that this lady says it perfectly.
One professor said that Japanese samurai lords back then used to use African black people as slaves. I mean, what? That's just impossible. No way. Please.
It can sound shocking to the people who don't know, but about 50,000 Japanese were enslaved and then sold overseas by samurai lords who turned themselves into Christians and then who were obedient to those Christians from Europe, like Portugal. Because a lot of European ships arrived in Kyushu, a lot of Japanese women in Kyushu were sold overseas as slaves. Since it's very close to other Asian countries, it was the first place where migrants from the Chinese continent and the Korean peninsula came to Japan.
Well, a lot of Japanese who want to protect our own cultures, like me, are concerned about it because when the rumor keeps spreading around the world for a long time, it will become the truth in the future, in the long run.
I think it was a really bad move from Ubisoft to not be open about their intention and reducing Yasuke to a political move, especially since the decision to include Yasuke was made after the BLM riots in 2020. This is not a game I'm going to play. And not only for this reason, really. It's just that Ubisoft games have really been sucking quite a lot in the recent years. I remember the days when Ubisoft were making pretty good games. I remember as a kid playing Rayman and Splinter Cell and Prince of Persia, and even those early Assassin's Creed games were actually pretty good, and I'm a pretty huge fan of the first Watch Dogs game, actually. The golden age of Ubisoft is over. We're not even living in the silver or bronze age of Ubisoft. No, we're living in the rusty, rotten age. And unless they make the game design more creative, because at this point it's really lazy, and it's not just Ubisoft games, a lot of games these days have a horrible game design and just feel so empty, shallow and boring. And I am not the only one who wants a change, who wants to see good games, because at this point the only good games we are getting are remakes, and perhaps some game series like a Dragon or Yakuza. That's the good shit, but there's just not a lot of it. And considering that the game prices are also going up, and now it costs like what, almost £100 to buy a game, in most cases it is just not worth it. You're not giving me any good reasons to keep buying your games, and so this is my farewell to Ubisoft. Yeah, have a good life or whatever, I don't care. But let me tell you what I do care about. You. If you stayed through this whole video and listened to me talking, thank you so much for watching, and consider liking and subscribing. It will help my channel a lot and I really appreciate that. I hope you have an amazing day and I will see you in the next video. Ciao.